Stories. And it's interesting how, like, as 10-year-olds, you kind of know the family stories, but you don't make the connections. Like, her three sisters died. They were burned alive in 1942 by Stalingrad, by German paratroopers that overtook them during the evacuation process. But again, we never used to say it was the Holocaust because, a bunch of Russians and Ukrainians and Moldovans were also burned there as well. They were just not discriminating and just piled everybody into a barn and did it. So, they died. She was a survivor, but, she was lucky. She evacuated and everything was fine. She lived, she had children, everything was great. And it's only later that those stories kind of started to connect, because also she was a daughter of a rabbi, because she had grown up in Moldova, which was part of Romania, and practicing rabbi, who was pretty big in her community and wrote a lot, but I never heard her talk in Hebrew or anything else. They spoke Yiddish occasionally, but because my mother could understand Yiddish, they spoke Romanian if they really wanted to be secretive, right? So this idea that we were Jewish, but there was no content, that this something was on the outside, was kind of like the defining moment of what Judaism was. And this idea also that the way that I would express my Judaism was actually by wearing an artifact, wearing an article of clothes. It was easy, and they did this. And as I grew up, in my 20s, I kind of forgot about all the Jewish things. I was lucky enough to go to Brandeis and meet my wife there. She was also a Russian speaker. She came in 1987 and lived across the hall. Thank God for co-ed dorm rooms, because otherwise I would not have the courage to go up to her. But, we met and we had our first child. And my wife was a product of private education in Boston, and it transformed her life. She went to BU Academy, Boston University Academy. And she was very keen on the fact that, and she's a professor at Stanford, that our kid is going to go to a private school because we want something that has very high academic standards, high character standards, and so we started looking at schools. And in that process, there was this one Jewish school in the town where we are in Palo Alto. It was called Gideon Hausner Jewish Day School. Does anybody know who Gideon Hausner was? So he was the chief prosecutor of the Eichmann trial, and he had this very famous speech that he gave, that he has to speak for the 6 million who cannot talk, and that every human being has to be prepared to answer the call of history. And that has been the mission of the school. Now, when we were looking at the school to try to figure out, do we send our child there or not, again, for us it was primarily academic, because I was in a public school and do pretty well and everything is fine, so why worry? But listen, let's check it out. And through this process, it was a very interesting thing. We got to know a lot of people, and we felt like home and like family. And I remember just thinking, it's like, okay, you know what, let's try this out for 1 year. If it doesn't work out, I'll pull my kid out. And the deciding moment was the sense that, look, in California, in the Bay Area, which is very progressive, very kind of liberal, very open-minded, I never really encountered anti-Semitism in my entire life. It doesn't happen. It didn't happen in the face. You didn't see it. You saw it in Europe. Like when you land in France, you're like, oh, I know I'm Jewish. But you didn't feel it in California, or at least I didn't. And I was worried that my daughter would not grow up to be Jewish, because my sense of a Jewish identity was from the outside. Somebody told me it was. And there was no like anti-Semitic pressure. And therefore, well, let me send her to a Jewish day school, because then she'll acquire some things and fill herself with content. And it will be positive content, something that would actually make her love the religion. And it wouldn't be a fight, but like something that would be joyful. Of course, after October 7th, I can't really say that anti-Semitism is no longer a problem. But what did change was, in those moments, I realized how powerful it was that she had gone to a Jewish school for the past 5 years of her life. In the way that she handled the situation, like our school has taken 24 refugees from Israel who are coming here, families, and we offer them scholarships, who can't, and they can go month to month until they're ready to come back. And so in her grade, there are 3 other kids who are from Israel, who they weren't in the kibbutzes, but they were there to experience the rocket attacks, and they knew that they were sitting in safe rooms, and it was a little bit different than all the other rocket attacks that would happen for like an hour, that this was on a constant basis, and they talked about this sort of stuff. And in our school too, our school started talking and doing the prayer for the hostages every day. And you don't put it kind of like together as a 10-year-old what you're saying, but it kind of like made sense. And one day she was at an ice cream shop and she saw the kidnap posters. And that's when she made the connection. And she said that day she cried 5 times at school with all her friends. And when we asked her about it, she said that the school is the only place where she felt like people understood what she was feeling. like it wasn't home. And I knew I made the right choice. And thinking back on my grandmother, I decided that I actually want to do something more symbolic. And so I put on a kippah, and I started wearing one, basically since about October 12th, every day. And it has been one of the most positive experiences of my life. Because again, look, I probably wouldn't wear this on the New York subway, but in California, it's been very, very powerful. And it's been powerful because random people approach me and say things, and they're usually Jewish, or they're in support of Jews. And they ask me if everything is okay with my family and friends, and I usually tell them okay. But the other one, the first experience was I was in a Costco, and talking on the phone, and this random person comes up to me, and she says in an Israeli accent, it's like, do you usually wear a kippah? I was like, oh, no, like, can you tell I'm not religious? And then she kind of looked at me, and we gave each other a hug. We just stood there in Costco hugging. And I know that this is powerful because our school is half Israeli. And the Israelis have been taking off their mezuzahs. They have been taking off their Jewish signs. And I looked at it from a perspective of, look, I realized that some of them actually have some pretty valid points. For instance, I was talking to one, and she said that I'm here on a visa that can be revoked by my company. And during all the progressive woke movements, for any political things that you could say, you can be fired. I know that my company is supportive of Israel right now, but is it going to be in a year, in 6 months, if things continue to go bad? And if I have something online, if I'm outwardly positive, could it be that I lose my status and my ability to stay in the United States? And she felt helpless. And so I wear it for those people because I don't feel helpless. I'm not going to be deported. I'm a citizen. But I want them to know that it is okay, that other people can do it, and that we're in this together. And all the other folks that have come up to me, there has been about like 7 of those instances. They have all been very positive. I have not had a negative one, and if one happens, I think the positive ones outweigh the negative. And so that's it. I wish, honestly, my grandma was here, but she passed away about 7 years ago, to really kind of like see this and to understand that this kind of like goes full circle. Because again, what I realized in this moment is that our identity may be shaped by the external world, but we can learn and we can fill it ourselves, and it's our job and our importance to fill it. And actually, this book has been kind of like a part of that journey of trying to figure out what it means to be Jewish as well. So I'll shift to the book a bit and talk about its genesis and why I wrote it, and the kind of the research, the historical research that I've done, and what similarities it actually has to our times and everything else. Has anybody heard of Michelin? Do you know this term? Does anybody know who Michelin are? Yep. Okay, I see some nods. Michelin is a German word. It means mixling. So the Nazis in Germany, when Hitler came to power, the way that they came to power, just to remind you, was through the legal system. It was a legal kind of like autocracy. It was mandated by the people. It was given to them by the vote in the Reichstag. So they had the legal system that was independent, and it was separate from it, and it wasn't like communist Russia where everything was wiped off and rebuilt. It still functioned within democratic institutions that gave them a veneer of legitimacy. And that was very important for the Germans. And one of the biggest challenges that they had was what to do with children who were offsprings of mixed marriages. Because the moment that the Jews were disenfranchised and basically lost their citizenship, or meaning their voting rights, they had a problem because there were Jews who were married to Germans. And their definition of a Jew, was, just to remind you, was not somebody who practiced the Jewish religion, but was somebody who had basically more than 3 or more Jewish grandparents. And since they kept great records, they could really tell who it was and who wasn't. And they came up with this category. It was Michelin first degree and Michelin second degree. First degree Michelin means you had 2 Jewish grandparents, and a second degree was you had 1. And those folks, they couldn't really vote, but they could go to the university, and they weren't deported, and they could be drafted in the armed forces. And in fact, they were the first to be drafted because they couldn't go to the university. Because of that, they were drafted into the army immediately at the beginning of the war. And there was about 150 of them that served in the Wehrmacht. So this history is covered by a book called Hitler's Jewish Soldiers. I highly recommend it, which is very interesting and was kind of like the inspiration for this. But what fascinated me was about, well, how does a society define these people who are on the border? And like, how does it deal with them? Because the way that they interact with those people who are like on the boundary kind of tells a lot about the actual social dynamic. And I looked at them as a representation of the German society as a whole, because in essence, if you think of an intermixed family of somebody like somebody's German, somebody's Jewish, you could think of a country in the same way. Like there was a marriage between these two people. They were married, and the country decided to divorce and then kill off that other side and deport them. So you can kind of look at that broader conflict on the family dynamics and how that played out. And that was really fascinating. I mean, just to think of an example too, at the time that I was writing this is when Trump was elected in the United States, and I remember all the rhetoric about deporting immigrants that he was talking about. And you could see that the situation would be the same. Like for instance, would you deport an immigrant who was an illegal immigrant but had a child who was born in the United States and was a citizen? Would that immigrant be protected during the deportation or not? And if you did deport him, what would you be doing? Like, because he had a spouse that was obviously probably an American or could have been, and you have an American child. Like, what do? We protect them. So like America, if it went ahead, would have to grapple with these types of questions that are like on the boundary in the same way that Germany did. Again, they did not care about this in Poland. If you had any ounce of Jewish blood or in the Soviet Union, you were killed. But in Germany proper, this was a big issue for them because somebody could be related to them that was high up in the party. The other interesting thing that they did, because there were so many, about hundreds of thousands of these mixed marriage offsprings, is they allowed you to seek basically what's called like a Deutsche Blutig certificate, where you could pursue an Aryanization. And Hitler reviewed every single one of those applications, and I think about 1,500 of them were granted. They were given to them. So in this context, when I came across this, for me a story started to form. A story where I was seeing a boy who I wanted to see how they would to experience this. Like, what would be a boy who grows up in a Christian world, thinks of himself as German and Christian, because his parents were Jews who had converted, and then discovers in this 1933 kind of setting that actually he's partially Jewish, and he would be what becomes a Mishling. The Mishling terminology became official in 1935. And actually before 1935, if you had any amount of Jewish blood, you could be considered Jewish, and it was very hard to determine it. So a lot of these mixed Jews welcomed that legislature because it gave them a clear sense of where they belong. Because any arbitrary official could decide that you were Jewish or you were not based on, it wasn't clear what criteria. So at that time, even like during that beginning, this 15-year-old boy is kind of like trying to figure out, well, who am I now? And where do I fit into the society? And my friends are joining the Hitler Youth, and I kind of want to do it too because I think of myself as German, etc. And one of the things that initially when I wanted to write this story, I wanted to see a person who could play kind of and cater to both sides. Because I imagine this character as somebody who could kind of move into the Jewish world and be sympathetic with it, and move into the German world and Aryan world and be sympathetic with that as well. And I honestly tried to write the novel then, where you could move back and forth. And one of the things that happened to me is that I had a character early on in the novel who's this Jewish girl who has a secret, but she very vehemently opposes the Nazi regime and the Nazification that is happening in the school. And he falls in love with her. And the moment that that happened, he could no longer play both sides. It was something very weird. It was like he had to pick. And he had to either break up with her and pretend that she didn't exist and reject her just like society, or he'd have to assume her position. Like, I will fight, I'm on your side. If something happens to you, it will happen to you as well. And that was when I realized kind of like this power of love. Not in the sense that it heals all, but it forces you to make a choice. Because if you love somebody that has an opposite view or endangers your life, you can't be neutral. You can't be on both sides. It just does not work. And it's not a discovery that I made. I mean, for me as an amateur writer, I discovered it for the first time when I was writing it. But in reality, it has precedence in literature. You could go back to like Romeo and Juliet that actually tells you, let's abandon the loyalty to our houses because we love each other and we realize that we can no longer be loyal to them. We have to actually escape that. Or the Russian novel We, that was a predecessor of the novel 1984. Remember that in 1984, the main character starts opposing the world that he's in when he meets a girl and when he falls in love. And it's only at that moment, because until that moment he was fine with the regime. There was nothing, there was no like push. There was nothing else that would make him change that. And that was a fascinating insight. And I'll read a little bit about that, about falling in love, in essence. And then I'll open it up for questions, and we can do Q&A. To give you context, I'm not going to start at the very beginning, because I want you to get a sense of Rebecca and who she is. And just to give you a little bit of a precedent, this story, again, opens up during the laws. And the laws in Germany in 1933 were passed incredibly quickly, like super quickly. People were disenfranchised and fired from jobs like immediately. We kind of think that it was slow, but it wasn't. It was like immediate, like no Jews can be employed, you're gone. And then everybody was scrambling to figure out whether they were Jewish or not, and pulling their ancestry records to present to the government. So in this context, the other thing is too, in the beginning of 1933, in April and in May, you don't have a Nazi curriculum yet. But you have folks who are part of the SA, part of the party, who are taking a lot of initiative. And so this classroom, their teacher is a Nazi, and seeing this change, this political change, he takes it upon himself to start teaching Aryan, basically philosophy, or like, the Aryan dogma, instead of the history class, which he usually teaches. And he rips down the tricolor flag and replaces it with the Nazi flag. And so that's kind of like the context of what happened in chapter 1. And now we'll start with 2. Tuesday, March 28th, 1933. The morning after Herr Wendell first wore the SA uniform, a banner with a large swastika greeted us as we entered the classroom. It blossomed over the blackboard in the place of the tricolor flag, looming large above the sound of shuffling feet, ready to wrap the room in its redness. Its presence was not wholly unexpected, given the fact that the streets of Berlin were budding with Nazi emblems, but it still startled me. I stared at the swastika as my legs kept moving until I bumped up against my desk and slumped down on the bench. The banner made me think of Heine, and I turned to the back of the room in search of the eloquently mournful eyes, hoping that the portrait, Heine's portrait, hadn't suffered the same fate as the tricolor flag. But the poet was nowhere to be seen. All the portraits were rearranged, forming a new line of black and white prints, the evidence of the excision. Yesterday's empty space amongst the new rows of scholars and statesmen was gone. If during a few exceptionally boring lessons I had memorized the original ensemble, the Bismarcks and the Gausses and the Kants, I would have never recognized Ernst Morris Arndt as the usurper of Heine's place. I never liked his work, especially the poem filled with the God of Iron. His snobbish cabbage face and the meek radish chin could never supplant Heine's soulful and yearnful expression. "Good morning, Hans," said Fritz. Fritz is a friend of his. He passed my desk and sat down, arms folded in front of him, back straight at attention. "Morning," I mumbled. That was our usual greeting, either that or a punch in the shoulder. I stared at his eager face, wondering if he was still the same person who a few grades back had pulled down the tricolor flag and used it as a cape for our anatomy scout. We thought it was one of his less daring pranks, but it caused an uproar, not because of the flag, but because he had fastened his uncle's Great War helmet to the skull. The school administrators and the teachers universally believed the image disrespected those who had sacrificed during the war. The helmet contained his uncle's name, and Fritz was discovered. He had had to serve a semester's length of detention every Saturday in the school library, his most severe punishment. "How do you think Bones would look wearing the cape?" I pointed to the flag. "What are you talking about?" Fritz glared at me. I waved my hand. "Never mind." Why would he pretend to have forgotten the incident? Maybe he no longer cared for admiration, or had forgotten that we called our skeleton Bones. Likely it was Gertrude's influence. Gertrude is his girlfriend. But then, who was influencing my mother when she denied remembering the time she had dragged me across the street from the fur-headed Jews? "Morning," said Ernst. He assumed his seat next to me and surveyed the classroom with a sly smirk, as if he were sitting on a throne. To him, all of us were his subjects. He used and abused their insecurities to fuel his jokes, benevolently of course, and without any hint of favoritism. The presence of the flag didn't seem to faze him. On the contrary, it added another ingredient for the concoction of his jokes. "Morning," I said. Herr Wendell strode into the room, wearing the same brown uniform as the day before. The class quieted down. "Hail Hitler!" He extended his arm, the flag spread out behind him like a massive rectangular wings. Everyone rose from the benches and extended their arms. The performance polished and synchronized, as if yesterday we had all stationed ourselves in front of our mirrors and rehearsed the greeting. Curiosity had driven me to try out the post in '94. It felt awkward then, but now as I stood physically in tune with my classmates, I experienced the power of our unity. I want to say at this point he doesn't actually know that he's half Jewish. If we had wanted to punch through a wall, it would have surely collapsed. I had this sense of unity in the choir when we held the same note, and I'd experienced it again years later in early 1939 when our unit trained to fire a light howitzer at 8 rounds per minute. Like she had the day before, Rebecca remained seated, reading her book, her hand repeatedly folding her hair behind her ear, then running her finger across her cheek, the subversive movement slow and seductive. Everyone, including Herr Wendell, pretended that she didn't exist. He motioned for us to sit down. Now, the other thing that I want to tell you is that Rebecca, in the last classroom, confronted Herr Wendell when he started teaching her. So there was a confrontation in front of the class. Herr Wendell says, "We will continue our lecture on the nature of," he turned to Rebecca, groping the air for the missing word, "the races. Rebecca, you are free to wait outside as you requested." She looked up from her book, blinking, as if she hadn't noticed anything that had happened before she was addressed. "We'll call for you when we resume our history lesson," he said. "Thank you, Herr Wendell." She tucked the book into her chest and with slow, deliberate steps walked out of the room. Since G2, when Ernst had attempted to christen her with the book-nose moniker for the first time, she had made it a point to demonstrate that she was happy being aloof. It was during recess. We had decided to play hide and seek, but she refused to join us. Instead, she sat on a bench, squinting from the glaring sun at one of her books. We persisted in asking her to join our game multiple times. We did hope that because of her lack of experience with our games, she would end up being the perpetual seeker and the butt of our jokes. She likely sensed that we were wanted and what we wanted and continued to refuse our entreaties. After a third attempt, Ernst lost his patience. He called her book-nose. And we all called her that for the next few weeks. But she answered to the name as if it were honorific. "I hope I'm the biggest book-nose that ever lived," she said. "Maybe I can read more books than anyone else. Now, wouldn't that be something? I'd be a real queen book-nose, wouldn't I?" I shared Rebecca's love of reading, but for me, reading was a private act. I would routinely get lost in the adventure novel or reread the same poem over and over again, basking in the feeling of rhyme and rhythm produced, but I could only submerge myself into the word-spun world when I was alone in my room and with the door securely closed. I couldn't imagine fantasizing about a character, thrusting myself into his world, feeling everything he felt, and doing it all in public. Seeing Rebecca freely express all those emotions on a school bench in full view of everyone else was like watching her undress her soul. I couldn't understand why she didn't want to get to know her classmates, to hear about their families, their hobbies, their fears, and their aspirations. Wouldn't she feel a sense of belonging if she knew what that shiner that Bambi, this is another one of his friends, routinely showed up with, were not from fights with upperclassmen from rival schools as he claimed, but from his father, who thought his doe eyes made him look like a girl? After all, we were part of the same class. We didn't all understand every lesson, nor did we all agree with the views expressed by our teachers, but by walking out in a lecture, she was denying the opportunity to have a common experience and find the classmates who shared her opinions. Herr Wendell raised his arm above his head and shook them, but as much as I tried to force myself to listen, I couldn't take in his words. "Mandatory branding will solve all our problems," whispered Ernst, smack in the forehead, "either a J or a C." I nodded without bothering to understand what Ernst was referring to. It didn't matter. I needed to leave, even if only for a moment, and ask for permission to go to the laboratory. When I slipped out of the room, I nearly tripped over Rebecca's foot. She stood at the dim light in the windowless hall, book in hand, her voluminous black hair falling along her elongated cheeks. I stared at her, strangely comforted by her presence. "In case you've forgotten, the latrine is down the hall," she said. She didn't look up from her pages, and I wondered how she knew who was standing there. Then I realized she hadn't addressed me by name. "You're brave," I said, surprised by my words. Rebecca looked up. "I'm not brave," she said. "I'm alone, and I know it." She moved her head from side to side to take a better look at me. "And you? Do you know that you're alone?" Puzzled by her statement, and even more by her question, I tried to avert my eyes, but I stood a head taller than her, and whenever I looked, she kept meeting my gaze. "You should hurry," she returned to her book. "You might miss out on the enlightenment." So I'll pause here and open it up for questions.
Thank you. You've given us a lot to think about. My name's Arlie Singer, and I'm the co-chair of the Holocaust Education Committee, along with Geraldine Katz. And I was thinking it might be helpful for the audience to realize that the book is actually written from the perspective of a person who's 102 years old and is looking back on his life. And he he says that he has been filled with regret. And he would say to people when they asked him, because he's living in Israel, I believe, isn't he?
He's in America, but...
Oh, he's in America, okay. But people would ask him what it was like to be a Jewish German, how he navigated that during those years. And he would just kind of say, well, I'll talk about that when I'm 100. And he turned out he lives to be 102. But it's obviously been something that was really on his mind a lot throughout his life. And some of the themes that really came out with me were regret, you know, his regret, and blame, you know, blaming himself and blaming others.
I mean, I can comment a little bit on that. I think one of the things to add about the Michelin as a category is that universally they were not accepted by either part of their society. To Jews, they were not Jews because they had fought, a lot of them had fought in the Vermont. And that experience, you know, how could you be a Jew and fight with the Nazis? And to Germans, they always, because again, they had grown up at this time where they had to prove themselves that they were Aryan, and they always constantly felt like they had to prove themselves. They also didn't feel like they were accepted. So a lot of them who basically, kind of the path went like both two ways. Like some of them would embrace Judaism after the end of the war and would go all in on one side, or the other ones would completely deny it. And would still be like, I'm German, I want to pretend this, to the point where there were stories where the person who wrote the history, I remember this one, this was really striking. He said that one of the military folks that he interviewed brought him to meet his buddies, like the German buddies that he fought with in his youth. And he was like, please don't say anything about me being half Jewish. This is like an 80-year-old man, right? Like with his other 80-year-olds. And at some point the guy left, and they were all like, yeah, we know he's half Jewish. We just haven't been saying anything because we don't want to like hurt his feelings. And because it was very easy to know, because they were not promoted. Hitler basically issued an order in 1940-41 recalling all of them from the armed forces because they fought in Poland and they fought in France. And after France, they were like, you know what, they're Jews in the army, like half Jews, let's just call them all back. But the thing is, if you're a military person, you got to think about it from this perspective. Anyway, who's going to track this down, A? But B, if that person was a good soldier, that's a person who the unit already trusts. I trust him, I'm not letting him go. So they would go, oftentimes they're like captains or they're lieutenants, and they would say, listen, I know there's an order to take you back, but do you want to go or do you want to stay? And a lot of them will be like, I want to stay. Because they saw this as an opportunity to save their relatives who were like in a camp. Because if they could get an Iron Cross, they could apply for the certificate, they would become Aryanized, and they'd be like, I'll be able to save my relatives. Let me try it because this is the global opportunity. At home, I'm not going to be able to go to the university. So, but if you were a German who kind of knew some of the context, you'd be like, hey, there's this guy who's private first class or second class, and he's been in the war since 1939, and he's still a private first class, and it's 1943? Okay, you're Michelin. So you didn't have to say much, it was kind of like obvious, but they really felt the sense that they didn't belong anywhere.
Yeah.
And it was really hard because the other thing too, to be clear, if they proclaimed themselves as I am a Jew, they would have been deported. So they were all Christian in name. They said that they were Christian, whether they identified with Judaism or not.
There was so much ambiguity,
Yeah.
and I really felt for these children. You know, they're 15 years old. They're in, I don't know if they call it high school in Germany, but that age. And suddenly one day, their teacher comes in, and he's raging, and he's ripping posters and pictures off the wall and putting up this Nazi propaganda and raging about Nazi propaganda, and they're in a state of shock. You know, they don't know what to do, and they're children. You know, and the other thing is that Hans, who's the main character in the story, at this point doesn't even know that he's Jewish, and because there have been so many secrets in his family's life, and that's another one of the big themes that create so much ambiguity for him in his life.
And I think this is the case also for, again, I was basing this, there's a corollary in the Soviet Union, which was like you were a child of the enemy of the people. Now, who was an enemy of the people was determined by other means, and it could be any reason because somebody denounced you for anything. But if you were a child of the enemy of the people, you had a mark. It was like you were half good, half bad, and you had to constantly prove yourself. And again, university was not an option, or it could be like far away. So there was the same kind of thing, but you wanted to fit into the society, and you had this black mark that you couldn't erase. And how do you go about doing this? And families who had this, I mean, it was a big challenge. And the other aspect when we're talking about the Jewish identity too that I saw is, there were the way that what was written in your passport, because again we wrote the nationality, was based on, you could choose based on your mother or father. So if you were in a mixed marriage, your child could decide which nationality they would write down. They didn't have, like in the Soviet Union, there was no concept of a Michelin. But they'd write this down. And in situations where they really wanted to find out if somebody had Jewish ancestry, they had a very easy way of doing it because everybody had a patronymic. So they would call the workplace of your parents, and they would ask and find out the patronymic of this. This would be like a Moscow University, and then they were like, okay, he had like, oh, Moses, this, that was this. Okay, so he's Jewish, so we now know that that's like, even though he has a Russian last name and it says Russian in the passport, he's not actually Russian. And you would be part of the quota. Those were those folks, and the parents itself. They had a hard time explaining this, especially because, and this is also kind of like reflected in the book. If a lot of them had grandparents or themselves were believers in communism, an ideology that in essence turned on them. And in his case, Hans's father is a businessman who embraces the opportunity of like, oh my God, this is going to be business, Jewish businesses are going to be wholesale, this is a great opportunity to get rich. And he was a supporter of Hitler because of this. So he has a family in which he actually has a pro-Hitler father who's taken advantage of the situation, and a mother who loses her job and loses her career. But the one thing I want to say about this was another insight I want to share, is in that context, when we are taught the Holocaust, we talk about the murder and the life like that were lost. But the thing that happened in civil society before we got to the murder was that people weren't thinking about this. It's so unfair that I was Jewish. They were mourning the life that changed. So like, for instance, his mother's biggest conflict is the fact that she chose to force herself to have a career as a woman. She was successful. This came about, and she lost her career, and she regrets the choice. And it's all about, like, it's more feminist in the sense. It's like her confrontation or her questioning whether I made the right choice as a career. The fact that she's Jewish is like the secondary thing that somebody like stamped on it because, okay, these governments are going to change, but right now I have my life to sort out, and why is this man that I studied with in my conservatory more successful than I am? And all of this sort of stuff. So I think a lot of the people who were there in the 1930s, they were experiencing this not as like, oh, this is anti-Semitism and this is wrong and this is bad and they're going to kill me. It's more like, I have a part of my life that's been cut off, and how do I reintegrate and rebuild my life? Mm-hmm. And to me, that was a lot more interesting because it was more, it was more tangible and something more concrete.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there was just a lot of complexity for these young children who had some Jewish ancestry. Should they lie? It seemed that their home life, at least for the main character, was full of lies. So does he continue to lie? What will happen to him if he lies? And there are some people in his life who know that he is part Jewish, and can he rely on them to protect him? It's just completely fraught. And so, I found myself asking myself over and over, what would I do in that situation, And, his father was certainly not a model father, taking advantage of the Jews, the Jewish businesses that had been taken away, or they realized they've got to sell and get out of there and sell at a discount. And he was pouncing on that. But his wife was Jewish, so he had no loyalty to her. So it It sure brought out the worst in him.
But some good in the overall society. So there are two things, historical moments, that you may be interested in. Any of you heard about the Rosenstrasse protest? You know what I'm talking about? Okay, so this is an interesting piece of history that's going to be telling. So, going in this complexity, the Jews who were in mixed marriages, meaning they were married to an Aryan, were protected. So in fact, when Berlin was liberated in 1945, there were about 5,000 Jews in Berlin, and they were all married to Germans. Now, Goebbels tried to deport them, and he tried to do this in 1943. After they lost in Stalingrad, they needed to some propaganda, something to say like, you know, that was going to be great. And so they decided the best answer to the loss of the Sixth Army was, let's deport all the Jews from like Germany proper that are married to Germans and that have legal protection. We'll do it in secret, and afterwards, you know, whatever happens. And they did it in Austria and Vienna. And in Vienna, they were very successful. They were able to deport them within like a couple of weeks. And after they did it in Vienna, they tried to do it in Berlin. Now, the thing that you have to know is the majority of the mixed marriages were actually, the women were German, because most of the time the men divorced their their Jewish wives. And the way that this also worked is, let's say you were protected until while the spouse, the German spouse, was alive. So literally, if your German spouse died, you would be like deported at the cemetery. In fact, this is where they went. They knew that you were going to be there. They'd pick you up from the cemetery and throw you on a tree. Because at that point you lost your protection. And it didn't matter if, you know, there was a son or anything else. But there's still a lot of like room and a lot of room for maneuver that you could, you know, you could kind of like figure out. So for instance, mothers who were Jewish, you know, if your son was in the army and you had like a photo of him and you showed it to a Gestapo that came, it was hard because the military was so venerated. And there's stories of like, you know, a soldier coming back from war, and he's walking with his mother, and his mother is wearing a Jewish armband. And he's stopped by the SS because he's like, what the hell are you doing fraternizing with a Jew? And the guy's like, this is my mother. He's like, well, take off the Jewish armband, because you can't be seen next to a German soldier wearing an armband. So there was a lot of like this kind of individual people trying to like, and it was very complex, it was very hard. So they wanted to get rid of all this complexity just once and for all. And they organized the deportations. They got them and they sent them to a holding house on Rosenstrasse. It was like a famous street, and there was about 3,000 of them at that time that they were able to round up right away. And that night, about 100 of the wives came because they were all interconnected in a network. And there is a reason. They say there is a socioeconomic reason why it was women who were mostly able to stay married. Part of it, again, if you just look at it from that socioeconomic perspective, the men, it was still a male-dominated society, so men had careers. And if you stayed married to a Jew, you would lose your job. There was no questions about it. You would be fired. You would not be killed. You would not be deported, but you know your income would be drastically reduced. So if you were able to kind of like do some business, some black market activities, great. And the women were very good at this. Because they did sewing, and they did laundry cleaning, and they did other things, and there was a lot of like informal jobs because they were not in the formal kind of like economy, and they'd been doing that for years, and so there wasn't a huge change for them. Yes, their husband lost their income, but I'm not going to throw out my husband. You know, I'm going to keep doing what I'm doing. So men tended to divorce, the women tended to not divorce, as a general statistic. And so it was the women that showed up, and also, they could kind of, they already, by 1943, because this was going on for about 8 years at that point, it really started kind of happening from 35, like it started in 33 and then really accelerated by 35, they all usually knew each other because they knew that these were the people that are most likely to support them. And so they, you know, they got on, I don't know, telephone or whatnot, what they had, and they came to this and they started like, we want our husband back. Like, let us talk to our husbands, let us this, just. And then the next night it was like 500 people, and it swelled to a couple of thousand people. And a lot of them were children in uniform who were wounded from the war. And so the SS brought out machine guns, and they were like, you know, we're going to clear this protest. And they fired in the air, and the crowd dispersed, and the crowd came back, and the crowd dispersed. And 7 days later, Goebbels is like, all right, I'm going to let him go because I don't want to murder anybody after Stalingrad. And then he let them all go. And in fact, it was hilarious because the Germans, as they were letting them out, just thank your German wives. They're a true testament to the spirit of Germanhood. They saved you. And like, you know, walked them out, and they never tried to deport them again. And so they were there at the end of the war. But yeah, it was very complicated and very interesting. But Go ahead, it's a question.
No, I have a question. The book starts with Hans, 102 years old, telling the story. I'm wondering if you base this in a true story or not?
I based it on the composite of a lot of the stories that I kind of read, because I took a point from here, a point from there. But he does follow a trajectory. And again, this story is just focused on 2 months and 33. I had originally envisioned this as, kind of like a 3 or a 5-part series, and we'll see if I'll write the others. But this one is just focused on 1993, because in reality, everything that happens afterwards happens in 1933, and just 1993, it's on a smaller scale. It's like the flag burning, the book burnings, the street fights in the school, but it's the same thing, just happens later on a larger scale, the same problems.
And the other question is, did you have the chance to talk to your grandparents about their experience? They share with you all the...
They did, but so my grandparents, so both of my grandparents fought in the Red Army, and they both survived. There's some interesting stories there. And one of my grandparents on my mother's side, who was from Moldova, or Romania at that time, he had 4 other brothers, 2 of them in France and 2 of them in America, and they all fought in the war, 2 on the American side, 2 on the French side. And on the Russian side, they all survived. And they all actually kept in touch during the Cold War. Through, the Americans would write to the French. One of the brothers, after France, moved to Romania. The French one would move to Romania, write to Romania, and the Romanian ones would talk this. And there was this kind of letter. And you see, for me, I think I grew up on a lot of the family stories, and what helped was that my uncle, his name was Boris Holban, or Brockman, that was the maiden name, but he changed it. The reason why the French folks, they were all in POW camps, but they had fake identities. They weren't marked as Jews, so they were not deported. So my uncle, Boris Holban, was part of the Communist Party in Romania, and was basically, what that means in the 30s is you blew stuff up. You exploded things, and you fought the Iron Guard, that was their political party, and you fought for communism and all of this. So he went to fight Franco in Spain, got detained in France, ended up in France when the war broke out, volunteered with fake papers, said they had very basic training, got on a train, got off a train into a German POW camp, literally. It was like, you got off the train into a camp. And because he actually spoke German, so he spoke many languages, he listened to the camp, and he realized that they were kind of like the guards were getting soft, and this was a labor camp in which they exchanged people with the local population that would come in. I think they were working on some quarry was there, so they would have professional workers come in from the village, and they would provide the actual core labor. So because of the communist connections, he was able to agree with one of the people to exchange clothing and just walk out of the camp during lunchtime, call out a number of the person who didn't, because there was a guard and everybody had a number, and they would call it out and look it up. And so he walked out and went to the Catholic Church, which at that time functioned as the place for POWs and Jews. And he got fake papers, and again, went into the underground and contacted the Communist Party. Again, 1942, he's like, hey, look, I'm out, what do I do? Where's the resistance? What are we doing? And the guys, the French Communist Party at the time was like, great, we're just organizing the resistance. You know how to blow stuff up. You'll organize the military wing of the Paris resistance, go. And so he started recruiting a lot of people, and at the heyday, his group numbered around 270 rebels, freedom fighters, and the thing is, they were mostly Jews. They were Jews who were 17, 18, 16, 19 years old, who had lost all their family, and they were not French. Maybe there was a few French people there. And they had very few weapons, and they would smuggle them around, and actually when they did hits or attacks, they would use the same weapon multiple times per day, and they would have a person carrying it to the attack, then a person picking it up, carrying it to the next attack. And he was coordinating all of this, the recruitment. And then that group had a tragic end. I think there are multiple theories why that happened. He was removed from his field, somebody else was put in charge. 2 months later, they were all in essence rounded up and killed by the Germans. But part of the hypothesis there was that, it was nearing 1944. And I think the French during the Revolution did not really want to show that the freedom fighters of France were a bunch of non-French Jews. And they wanted it to be more French. So they were looking to kind of clear out these kind of like sporadic battalions, and they really just wanted to get rid of it. And my uncle felt that, or at least that's the story. He wrote a memoir about it. There's a bunch of documentaries, films that were made about like accusations going back and forth. This is a contentious issues, and again, he resisted the kind of things that they were pushing them to do because he knew that they were going to end up being caught if they accelerated their activities. But I was leading with this is that as a family and the stories that I grew up on, they were all very like, we are Jewish, we're proud, we're going to fight back, and we will win. So I always had that feeling, just of the kind of like history and again the yarmulke, and just yes, I'm proud of who I am, and we will answer the call of history when that call comes.
As a child in Russia,
Yeah.
or
And even here.
Of course, if I can return to October 7th,
Yes.
it's all looming
Yes,
right
of course.
in the background. What do you make of Putin's kind of tacit support for Hamas, and what implications does that have for Soviet Jewry?
For Soviet Jewry, or like the Soviet Jewry that's out? Because like when I hear Soviet Jewry, that's Jewry that's outside of Russia. Do you mean like? So you mean us in? Okay. Well, it just one of the more interesting things is that, when the war started with Ukraine, and when Israel started to support Ukraine kind of underground a bit, without being very forthcoming in terms of what they were doing. But I think some of the main activities that they did is they centralized the air defense grid, because before the war and during the initial phases of the Ukrainian war, each radar and air defense system in Ukraine acted separately. So you could only kind of coordinate air defense on a local level. So that means that if you were like in Kherson and a rocket was flying through Kherson because it was launched from the Black Sea, but it was heading towards Kiev, you couldn't tell Kiev that a rocket was on a trajectory toward you. You had to wait until it entered Kiev space and got picked up there. So the Israelis had a software system that they developed, and that was one of the first things that they implemented. The other things that they've helped Ukrainians that they do talk about is kind of post-war trauma and just war trauma, because they have a lot of experience with that. So a lot of therapists were there, and they were on the ground training people. So when all of this started to go down, Putin closed the representation in Israel for immigration. So I think that was a very clear message to say, if you're going to mess with us, we're going to mess with your Jews that are still in Russia. And there's still enough of them for it to matter. So I believe that Putin is a Soviet leader. When McCain said that, when I looked into his eyes, I saw three letters, and it was KGB, I believed him. And I think he was one of the few American politicians at that time in the early 2000s who saw that and recognized that for what it was. I think in that sense, Putin is willing to use Jews as leverage, and always has, just as the Soviet Union had, because they always knew that, look, the Jewish community of America can be swayed in a hostage-like situation that we're in right now. And if you threaten the hostages, they may be able to do the things that I want, and I can trickle them out to get what I want. And that policy and that approach is what Hamas is doing in the same way. Let's do a ceasefire. We'll do something. But like that concept is the same. So I don't believe that Putin is like necessarily anti-Semitic, but he's very well versed in the instruments that are necessary to put pressure on the liberal, democratic, democracy like ours. And he's using them right now. So I don't know if that answers your question.
In a way, but he's sort of supporting an organization that feels that they have the right to kill any Jew, right? And he's supporting that organization. And he has how many hundreds, how many millions of Russian Jews are there? Are they at risk?
They are at risk, I believe, and they will be at risk. In fact, there was a very interesting segment on RT, like Russian television. There was an interview of one of the ministers, I forgot which one, it was actually on the first day of the war with Israel. And he basically told the reporter that, he's taking dirty money, and that we in Israel know that you support Hamas, and once we clean up our backyard, we're coming after you. This was like a minister in government saying that on Russian television. So they know what's going on, and I think Putin would do it, because what I do think, though, is that it's not anti-Semitism that's fueling it, it's anti-democracy. He is an autocrat who is against any democracy, and Israel is little Satan, we're big Satan. He may not use those words, but we're part of that democratic alliance, and Israel is a democratic alliance in the Middle East, part of the US presence, and anything that will destabilize them, I think, will be good for him. So I see this as a massive shift from what he was doing beforehand, and I don't think he cares one way or another about any of the people that died. Russians in general do not value life in the same way that Americans do. They don't have that concept. So he wouldn't value Jewish life any more than he values Ukrainian or Russian life, and he's willing to get rid of like hundreds of thousands of people to get his name in history without thinking twice about it.
Like all the new recruits that
Yeah.
are.
Throw them in. Throw them in. Yeah. Is there a question?
Yeah, different subject.
Sure.
I think that, actually slightly a little bit, not realized if I was, I think that was sort of interesting to me. I remember very good times, if you remember, you asked people when you were at Michigan, and you said, and in my head I knew it as a slur. I was familiar with it, but as a you know, half-breed fundamentally, right?
Yes.
And then you were talking about how, and I had never really conceptualized it as like a neutral
legal term,
legal
yeah.
term.
Yes.
And you were talking about how it was somewhat welcome in some way,
Yes.
kind of. And I was wondering if you might expand on that a little bit.
Yes, so let me expand on that. So in 1933, when all the laws in Germany are passed that basically deny Jews work. Now, again, I just want to be clear. The largest employer was the German government. And so teacher, university professor, like anything, banker, like all of this, they were in essence nationalized institutions. Now, private business, they didn't demand any laws, but the way that they forced the private institutions to Aryanize, because that's what they call it, Aryanization, would be to hold contracts with this. It's like, look, we're not going to do business with you until you become an Aryan entity or until you fire your Jewish employees. So, but the first step, the very first step, that was like, let's fire all the Jews. So the biggest question they had is, well, what does it mean? What is it Jewish? And he didn't have a definition of it, and because he didn't really have a definition, it was unclear. Like if you believe you were Christian, because people were trying to baptize themselves at that point, are you still Jewish? If you had like one Jewish grandparent, are you Jewish? So there was a lot of this ambiguity, and at the end, these decisions were actually made. By the individuals themselves. So I'll give you an example. I want to just pull something out. Just give me 1 second of what I mean. So they needed to take a census. So look, I'll give you, and this is one interpretation of the way the census is taken. So this is something that Hans has to do in school. He has to pick one of three things. It says, I'm a true-blooded Aryan or an offspring of a mixed marriage where one parent is of Aryan origin. Both of those right now were protected. They were in the same category. I am a Jew whose father fought at the front during the Great War for Germany or her allies. That was a protected Jew until 1935, when Hindenburg died. Or I'm a Jew. So the fact is, this school that he's in chose to put together the offspring of mixed marriages and true-blooded Aryans in one category. Because again, there was no clear instructions of how you do it, versus somebody else wouldn't have to make that choice. And there were no guidelines. And in 1935, those guidelines came out. In fact, there's posters where you kind of measure themselves. And so the folks who were in these situations where, again, think about this. Again, that word is at least one parent is of a mixed marriage, right? So or an offspring of a mixed marriage where one parent is of Aryan origin. All right, so imagine that you were a Michelin second degree, which means you have one grandparent who is Jewish. And it was left for anybody to decide whether, let's say it was your father whose grandfather was Jewish and mother was Jewish. Well, he was an offspring of a mixed marriage. Does that mean he's Jewish or not? And that was all kind of left to interpretation. Versus the guidelines that came out in 35 were incredibly clear. They're this is this or this, and that's it. And those people on those fringes who were second degree Michelins, I'm like, oh my God, thank God I'm protected. I'm excited. I now have a very firm status. This person is not going to call me a Jew and this one is Christian. I'm just this. And I can kind of hide it, because the other thing is the people who were Michelin second degree, they could marry. In fact, they were supposed to marry Aryans, and their children would become true Germans in the next generation. So it was kind of like this way of entering society. Versus what was interesting, the Michelin first degree could only marry each other. So they were in effect perpetuating this kind of like group that was in between. And the truth is, the writing said that they intended to get rid of those as well, but after the war, because right now they were kind of useful. Again, nobody knew that, everybody hoped for it. And you know, there were other things that were like, one of the laws that was passed at that time was like the fraternization laws, like you could not have sexual relationships with married if you were Jewish. But the truth is, this is very interesting, is that, okay, during the war, pretty much all men of eligible military age were at war. So remember how I told you that Michelin, after 1939, 1940, they could come home? A bunch of them did come home. So suddenly you have these young men who are not in the military. And what were they doing? They were fraternizing with the Germans. Because the German girls didn't really care much. Or when they asked, they kind of knew, and it was like this. And then you have stories of, you know, some denouncing this. And then you'd have a person who would be sent to like Auschwitz, but he has a medal. And he has a photo of himself in uniform. And he goes up to the guards and he's like, dude, you want to kill a person who served for this? You haven't even been to combat. And they'll be like, oh, I don't know what to do with you. All right, you were sent to Auschwitz, I'm going to put you in the nicest part. You know? Yeah, VIP treatment. But they were safe because they had been, again, they fraternized with a German woman. They were denounced, they were sent to a camp, but they had status because they had a ribbon or they had a medal or, you know, they had a photo of themselves in uniform. All right, any other questions?
Got a question.
Yeah.
So regarding this marking you mentioned Michelin, maybe I missed it. When did it start actually? It started.
It started when the Nuremberg laws in 1935. So yeah, the initial laws that fired all Jews were in 1933 by like April, but the Michelin laws came in 1935. So
What was it marking before? The reason I'm asking, like recently.
What was it? What before?
It's marking like nationality in German passport. I had a chance to go for my old passport. I came from Soviet Union,
Yep.
Anyways, and when I was looking at my old passports and my wife as well, I look at this and it's, I think it's fifth column and it says nationality
Yep.
and it says Jewish.
Right.
Like in non-Jewish, that's Ukraine or because I was born in Uzbekistan, it says Yehudi.
Mhm.
In Arabic, Turkish, Yehudi
Yeah.
means Yehudi and it's Jewish. Anyways, so just wondering who picked up from whom? Is it Germany, like a Hitler picked up from Stalin, or it was before, a long time ago, this marking of nationality?
I don't know, to be honest with you, that when it happened in the Soviet Union, I believe it happened right away because they changed the gubernias, like the governorships, like to the republics pretty quickly. And plus, the Soviets used nationalism as a basis to get power because they knew that they wanted ethnic strife to create war. So I'm pretty sure that in the Soviet Union it was very early on that they were national. But the Germans, I think it wasn't less about them. They didn't have this before Hitler came in. But what he needed was a legal way to mark somebody that was Jewish. And so, you know, the laws were gradual. So first it was like, I think your passport stayed the same way, but then, you know, by like 1938, 39, they passed laws that you have to like put Sarah or Abraham in your middle name if you were Jewish, and you had a J marked in your passport. But the J came later, so beforehand there was still like ambiguity. And even if you had that in the passport, it took a while before like 1939 when you had to wear the armband. And, you know, on the day when the armband became legal, like you also read these memoirs of people. And it was like, oh my God, I didn't realize that all these neighbors are Jewish because they're coming out with this, because they were able to still blend in and to kind of like lead a normal semblance of life. And also the other thing that I want to say, you know, this last comment, so in order to write this book, I read a lot of memoirs of survivors and some Michelin, not everybody because there were not a lot of Michelin writing just in general. And what fascinated me was the people, there were like U-boats There were U-boat hunters. The U-boats were the people who pretended to have a fake identity in Germany. U-boat hunters were Jews who were trying to find the Jews with the fake identities, who were paid and usually hired by the Gestapo. So you read these memoirs of all the survivors and you realize that, you know, you had to provide shelter. And a lot of the times they were always moved around between place to place, and that kind of changed my view and made me, you know, going back on like the positive experience, that there was actually a lot of people that were trying to be positive. And Berlin in generally was not an anti-Semitic city. And the thing that was actually very hard for Jews was the fact that, especially in Berlin, like unlike Munich or in other places, there was, you know, if you wore a Jewish star on the metro, a person could like drop an apple in your pocket, or just kind of like give you a sign that like, we know you're suffering. And they would do this on a regular basis. And like, you know, people would hold on to these things, that they were very meaningful, because again, the population was very intermixed up to that war. But because of that, they made it so hard, because you had like individual people doing nice things, and you had a genocidal government. And like, it was like, how can this government be genocidal when these people are so nice and they kind of like feel it? So that positivity of people trying to do something kind to Jews was very prevalent and very present. It wasn't like, you know, it's the same thing, like you have these outliers. But, you know, going back to your questions on the passports, it was, what was required, it wasn't about a passport, it was for every employment, you needed to provide your ancestry records. And there was an official way to get them. And they created basically these genealogy institutions, like institutes where you like had to go get this. This was an official request that had a stamp, and you had to present that as part of your file. So it was a little bit different than the passports. Then they got to the passports later on. Any other questions? Anything else? Yes, go ahead.
Questions I have for you.
Yeah.
Go back to you. Thank you very much for the history lessons. I felt when I'm back in school and listening to history. What made you like a successful businessman, Ivy League graduate in technology, and become a freelancer?
Freelance writer.
Yeah, just I want to
Sure, I could talk about this a lot. And actually, my business partner asked me this question all the time. She's like, "Why do you spend so much time writing? You know, if you like work a little harder, we can make a bit more money." So I think it's a kind of like two-part answer. I remember actually getting my computer science degree. You know, obviously because of immigrant parents, who were like, mom was like, "Yo, you need to support yourself. After college, you're not getting anything, buddy." So the computer science degree helped, and I remember feeling that, okay, I got my first job, I'm making like whatever, I can live on my own, okay. What am I gonna do for myself? And I was like, oh, I'm gonna get a creative writing degree, let's do it. And my dad was a poet. He became a poet in his late, he wrote all his life, but like he really started writing during immigration. It was like the switch for him, so he's published in Ukraine in the 90s and the 2000s. And I remember this one thing, you know, to your question, by the way. When we came to the States, we came with those 2 bags that were allowed, you know, the bowl, like those things. But my father stayed behind for about a year. He came a year later, and he would send us packages of the books that we had. It was like non-stop Russian books, like, you know, Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, and Turgenev. It's like 1,000 books that he shipped over this period of a year, and I grew up with these books. And you know, I kind of call the immigration up to '89. It was the ideological immigration, like we're anti-Soviet, we're willing to risk being like refuseniks. My wife came from that generation. That was a very different immigration. These people were like, I'm Jewish or I'm anti-communist. Or it's like I have a belief. And people from '89, it was an economic opportunity in immigration. I was like, look, life is better. Parents made a mistake. They ended up here, like especially for my grandparents. My grandfather was like, I'm a big shot, and I had 5,000 people that I was a director of like this textile factory, and my brother over here did kind of similar, and he's doing much better in his life and has a much bigger house and cars and everything else than I did. I did something wrong. I picked the wrong horse. Let me move my family over. Let's go over here. So it was this more economic immigration, but you know, for my dad, it was very important that we have this literature and you kind of keep the Russian language going. So like our daughter goes to Russian school, she speaks fluent Russian, she writes, she reads, even though she was born here. You know, those books were very important. And what struck me was in all my life, the Russian immigrants I encountered, most of them didn't have those books, or at least in the area that I grew up with. And I remember meeting my wife and just talking to her, and it was just again, also this feeling of familiarity, of like something familial. And the first time that I visited her home, I saw the same books on her shelves. And I think it's that feeling that, you know, this is something that I grew up with. Books were valued. I married another person for whom books were valuable. I want to create books that have some value, at least for us. And the business is a great way to support my addiction.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
Boris Glants, I want to thank you very, very much. Such an interesting discussion and a wonderful book, and you've really given us a lot to think about, lots of ethical issues, and lots of information that I wasn't aware of about some of what people struggled with during the war. A lot of new information. You know, it astonishes me every time someone such as yourself takes the time to do the research, how much we still don't know about what happened to Jews during the Holocaust. So thank you very,
Thank
very
you so
much.
much.